out of the four Imams is the only one that didn't write a work. There are some things that have been attributed to him, but there is no undisputed text from Imam Abu Hanifa rahimahullah. So he's never been able, he never had the opportunity to defend his madhab, to defend his approach, and so on and so forth. It's really his students. Whereas the other schools of thought, they have writings from the Imams themselves. So Imam Abu Hanifa rahimahullah is unique in that regard. Also, Imam Abu Hanifa rahimahullah, his madhab in and of itself, the way he approached fiqh rahimahullah ta'ala, was that he invited people to contribute at his level. So the fiqh of Abu Yusuf could very well be the Hanafi fiqh, could be the mu'tamid, it could be the trustworthy position, the strongest position in his madhab, because he was so strong on letting people contribute and letting people derive their conclusions and things of that sort. What were his usul? What were his principles? Because a madhab at the end of the day, these schools of thought, are a set of principles. They're not a set of opinions. And that's one of the greatest misconceptions that people have about madhahib, is that they're sets of opinions. Okay? If you do this, you're being Hanafi. If you do this, you're being Hanbali. Right? If you follow local moon sighting, you're Hanafi. Even though Imam Abu Hanifa was a global moon sighting, but that's another discussion altogether. But the point is that if you follow this, you're this. And you take one understanding of the Hanafi madhab, all right, from one group of scholars in one particular context, and that's the Hanafi madhab. And that's very, very, very incorrect. A Hanafi from Egypt, from Al-Azhar, looks very different from a Hanafi from Deoband. Very different. They have their different approaches, they use the usul and they derive opinions and so on and so forth, but it's a set of principles. So his usul, the first one of his usul, is the Quran. The first main source is Al-Quran. How does Imam Abu Hanifa rahimahullah approach the Quran though? All of them would say the Quran. Imam Abu Hanifa rahimahullah ta'ala would look at the mutlaq, the absolute ayah, as opposed to the muqayyad, the specific case that it was referred to. What that means is he was against a takhsis, he was against specifying incidents and making it the general rule, making it the injunction for everyone else. All right? So he will take, and I'm going to give you guys an example because I want you guys to actually see how he derives some of his opinions in that regard. Okay? He would rather take a general rule from one ayah in regards to an issue rather than a specific incident that was revealed to people and then make it, or make the ummah bound by it. So for example, Imam Abu Hanifa rahimahullah, one of the opinions that no one else agreed with him on, in his madhab, it's allowed for non-Muslims to enter al-Masjid al-Haram. So Mecca, Masjid al-Haram, non-Muslims can go there as well. Why? Because he said that the specific ayah referred to where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned to them, إِنَّمَا الْمُشْرِكُونَ نَجَسٌ, that they are spiritually impure and do not let them come in and so on and so forth. He said that that's when they were still worshipping their idols and so on and so forth. He said as long as someone comes to the haram and they're not worshipping the idols and they're not bringing that stuff with them, then it's permissible for them. So that was actually his opinion. So he'd rather take the umum, he'd rather take the am, the general rule, than the takhsis of a situation and say that's referring to something very specific there. Okay? Then you have the sunnah. The second one is the sunnah. As we said, Imam Abu Hanifa rahimahullah ta'ala, Ahlul Ra'i did believe in hadith. They didn't reject a hadith. However, Imam Abu Hanifa rahimahullah ta'ala lived in a context where a hadith were being fabricated due to the politically turbulent times, due to the mixing of philosophies and so on and so forth. So he would reject a hadith that he wasn't convinced was authentic. So his conditions were more strict. Not because he wasn't the scholar to scrutinize chains of hadith. That's not Imam Abu Hanifa rahimahullah's thing. But Imam Abu Hanifa rahimahullah ta'ala would not use a hadith that he was not convinced by. It has to be undisputedly authentic. It is absolutely incorrect to say that Imam Abu Hanifa rahimahullah rejected authentic hadith and used his reasoning instead. That's one of the most simplistic and naive statements that or clearly someone that has never studied fiqh would say that. All right. Rather, he was very strict in what ahadith he would use. And realize here, when it comes to ahadith, they had the fabricated ahadith, then you have chains of ahadith that might have become weaker in later points of history. And Imam Ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah actually wrote a book called رفع الملام عن الأئمة الأعلام. رفع الملام عن الأئمة الأعلام. Imam Ibn Taymiyyah wrote it, right? So shatter your misconceptions right away, which means lifting the blame off of the great scholars, the great imams. And Imam Ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah mentions that sometimes a hadith became weaker later on. the sanad became weak later on in the hadith. So for example, by the time, when it was at the time Imam Abu Hanifa rahimahullah, might have been a sahih hadith, might have been authentic, but then a later link, a later chain in the link was weak. So the narrator that came after that narrator that lived in his time was the weak chain that allowed the hadith to be classed as da'if or inconclusive. So it's not appropriate to just say that he rejected a hadith. He did go into extensions in ijtihad and in qiyas, the hypotheticals, which is something that Imam Malik criticized very heavily, very harshly. Okay, what if this happens? What if that happens? Going on to extensions and using a hadith and so on and so forth to try to cover as many situations that haven't happened as well. And obviously some people took it a little bit too far. Now, is Imam Abu Hanifa rahimahullah a trustworthy person? There's also the debate about what his role is in hadith. And look, you find early scholars, look, no one was an angel here. People would debate these things, all right? So, Al-Qadi Ayyad, the great Maliki scholar, rahimahullah ta'ala, he criticized Imam Abu Hanifa rahimahullah in hadith. He said that Imam Abu Hanifa rahimahullah wasn't as knowledgeable in hadith as the others. He didn't have the knowledge of hadith that the others had. He was a great scholar in fiqh, but he wasn't a great scholar in hadith. Yahya bin Ma'in, who's one of the great scholars of hadith, Yahya bin Ma'in said not only is he thiqah, he's thiqah. He's beyond trustworthy in hadith, and Yahya bin Ma'in is a great hadith scholar. And Al-Dhahabi says that Yahya bin Ma'in was Hanafi muta'assib, like he was a fanatic Hanafi, and he was a scholar of hadith, right? So there are differences of opinions here about what was his status in hadith. No one would dare question his trustworthiness or question his knowledge. It's about what he chose to accept and reject and use reasoning instead. And even in his time, that was a way to fabricate something against him, was to say that he rejected hadith. Muhammad al-Baqir, the great grandson of the Prophet ﷺ, who was a teacher of Imam Abu Hanifa, he came to him. The first time he met him, he said to him, "You're the one that rejects the statements of my grandfather in favor of your reasoning." Imam Abu Hanifa rahimahullah said, "Allahu Akbar, who does that?" And he sat him down and they went through some masail and things of that sort. And he put al-Baqir to ease that I never reject a hadith. I never would reject a hadith that I consider to be authentic. And they went through some very specific situations where Imam Abu Hanifa said, if I used my reasoning, I would say this. But instead, the Quran says this, the hadith says this. So I don't use my reasoning here. So al-Baqir became satisfied with that and he took him as a student. Okay, but that's the first incident, was actually confrontation. Like, you're the one that rejects the statements of my grandfather. Okay? There was a statement from Ahlul Hijaz, the people of Hijaz, mocking the people of Iraq. They said that for every 100 ahadith, they say that 99 are false and they only take one. But again, the idea was that that they had to be very strict due to their climate about whether or not to accept a hadith. And many of the collections of ahadith, the majority of the collection of ahadith came after Imam Abu Hanifa rahimahullah's time anyway. So again, there's no questioning his knowledge and questioning how he used the ahadith in his madhab. He definitely used the sunnah, and that was the second one of his usul. Then you have qawl al-sahabi, the statement of a companion. That's number 3. Qawl al-sahabi. Now Imam Abu Hanifa rahimahullah said that I have the right to pick and choose between the sahaba. And now you see the influence of Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, Ali ibn Abi Talib, and Abu Musa al-Ash'ari. These were the 3 sahaba that settled in Kufa. So Imam Abu Hanifa rahimahullah, he preferred the opinion of the sahaba that came to Iraq. Some of the scholars, subhanAllah, and this is really brilliant, they say that not only for their ilm, but because he said they understood our context. Which shows you again that when they gave fatwa, they understood that they were giving fatwa for a particular context. They didn't expect people to just copy-paste fatwa and copy-paste fiqh for their things. So these were the Sahaba that settled in Kufa, settled in Iraq. And he said, as for the Sahaba, I have a right to pick and choose who I'm going to favor. Right? Because they differed amongst themselves. And Ibn Mas'ud radiallahu anhu overwhelmingly is the most influential figure in the Hanafi madhab. Alright? But he said, as for everyone after the Sahaba, hum rijal wa nahnu rijal. They are men and we are men. Now why is this significant? Remember the confrontation with the man with Abu Hanifa over saying Al-Hasan made a mistake? There was this idea, and obviously it wasn't propagated by Al-Hasan himself or Ibn Sirin or these great scholars. Just like Abu Hanifa rahimahullah didn't propagate himself as the only opinion. Like, he knows his opinion is at the end of the day an opinion of man. It's not infallible. So Imam Abu Hanifa said, look, as for everyone else, hum rijal wa nahnu rijal. We will use our reasoning. They are men and we are men. We will use our reasoning to arrive at our opinions. We're not bound by the opinions of the tabi'een. We're not bound by the opinions of them. Then you have number 4, al-qiyas, using analogy, okay, in your reasoning. Using analogy. Qiyas means analogy. It's to take an incident, find the illah, find the reason for the revelation of a particular ayah or hadith being said in regards to that, and then use that to apply it to other rulings that came up. Okay, so something happened with the Prophet ﷺ like this, take it and apply it to a different situation that's simple. So for example, the very classical example of qiyas, Ibn Abbas radiallahu ta'ala anhu comparing the pregnant woman to a sick person, someone who's temporarily sick, when it comes to making up days of fasting. Okay, should she make up days of fasting or should she just pay fidya? Ibn Abbas radiallahu anhu says, well, she's like the one who's temporarily sick, where temporarily she's unable to fast, then she's able to fast, so she should make up the days. So this is the classical example of the use of qiyas. Then he has iftirad al-masail. Iftirad al-masail means hypothetical problems. And this is something, again, that he was criticized for and his students were criticized for. It helped a lot, but some people took it to an extreme. Okay? It helped a lot, but some people took it to an extreme. Imam Malik, rahimahullah, if you ask him a question, he says, did it happen? You say no, he said, then don't ask me. Imam Abu Hanifa, rahimahullah, will list out all kinds of possibilities. And the Hanafi ashab, the ashab, they'll list out all these different types of things, and then they'll say, did it happen? Did it not happen? That doesn't matter, that's irrelevant. How would you deal with it if it did happen? Then you had 6th, which is istihsan. Istihsan means juristic preference. Imam Abu Hanifa rahimahullah ta'ala, he said that a faqih, a scholar, can give preference to one rule over the other because his heart feels that it might be correct. Meaning, if the evidences seem to be sort of balanced and things of that sort, he can just go with the one that's even over his reasoning, and he can say, my heart feels comfortable with this one, and so on and so forth. And Imam Shafi'i rahimahullah rejected that entirely. So when Imam Shafi'i took the school of Abu Hanifa and the school of Malik, he rejected this concept entirely of just how you feel about it, instead of going into reasoning and things of that sort. Then the last one is al-hiyal. Al-hiyal is again something that can be used for good or bad. The linguistic translation of hiyal is evasions. Evading certain, it's basically loopholes. Hiyal are loopholes. What that means is, if someone is in difficulty, in order to remove the things that are causing, al-mada'iq, that are causing difficulty, you find loopholes for people to get out of certain situations that they're in. Those are the usul of Imam Abu Hanifa rahimahullah, the famous opinions. And you will find, again, the context of ahadith should be taken into consideration when you're studying opinions, when you're looking at certain things that happen, as opposed to just automatically coming to the conclusion that the Imam rejected the hadith or the Imam did not know the hadith. Okay, so Imam al-Dihlawi, for example, he takes the opinion of delaying the Asr Salah. This is something that was narrated by multiple of the tabi'een. It was narrated by Ibrahim al-Nakha'i, rahimahullah ta'ala. And again, all of these things come from, at the end of the day, they can be traced back to the Sahaba. So delaying the Asr to later than the other madahib, that's something that there is precedence for. Now subhanAllah, interestingly enough, in the madhab of Imam Abu Hanifa rahimahullah, Abu Hanifa himself believed in delaying the Asr. Both Al-Qadi Abu Yusuf and Al-Shaybani believed what the other 3 madhahib believed. So that shows you in the Hanafi madhab there is room, right? There was room always for these scholars to debate and to come to their own conclusions and things of that sort. So they disagreed with Imam Abu Hanifa rahimahullah on that point. But again, it's not out of nowhere. Obviously the issue of not doing rafa' yadayn, as strong as the evidences would be, for the other madhahib, there is an authentic hadith from Ibn Mas'ud radiallahu ta'ala anhu that he didn't do rafa' yadayn. There is a correlation there between Ibn Mas'ud and Imam Abu Hanifa rahimahullah. It's okay for these people to go and to prefer certain evidences to others when they all seem authentic and when the Sahaba choose to do different things, rather than to reject them as completely baseless. Right? Even Imam Bukhari, by the way, Imam Bukhari wrote, because the rafa' yadayn, believe it or not, now it's not like it is now where people like break each other's arms in certain countries if they do rafa' yadayn and call them names and labels and stuff like that. But even then, rafa' yadayn became a very hot topic issue. Imam Bukhari wrote a book called Juz Rafa' Yadayn, where he documented 170 authentic ahadith that he said proved Rafa' Yadayn. And then they asked him, so are you saying that Imam Abu Hanifa is one of al-khurafat, like he just makes things up? He said, no, I'm not saying that. He said, a'udhu billah. Hasha, no, I'm not saying that at all. We have our evidences, they have their evidences. At the end of the day, these evidences are up for debate, right? How you understand particular hadith, how you contextualize them, how you understand time of revelation and things of that sort. So no matter how convinced I am in my view, that doesn't mean that I would accuse the other one of having a baseless view. And of course, Imam Abu Hanifa rahimahullah ta'ala, he says, خُذُوا مِنْ حَيْثُ أَخَذْنَا. This is narrated in the Hashiyah of Ibn Abidin. Take from where we took. He used to tell his students, take from where we took. So he encouraged his students to use his usul and to contribute to his madhab. Ash-Shaybani, out of all the students of Abu Hanifa, used to disagree with him the most, because he had the most exposure to Ahl al-Hadith. He went to study with Malik for 3 years and so on and so forth. He lived in that environment. So they would say the two parties, because they tended to disagree. Even though, again, Ash-Shaybani wrote the encyclopedia of Hanafi fiqh.